bathroom. We wash our hands and face with it. We cook with it. Moving to the kitchen, we clean up dishes with it. We wash floors with it. We use the dishwasher with water. Water is an amazing gift of God. In fact, water makes it necessary. Water is necessary for life. We wash our cars with it. We water our lawns and gardens with it. We swim in it and run through sprinklers. Water has always been a symbol for life. In fact, each human being is made up of about 65 to 70% water, depending on your composition, which means I am about 150 pounds of living water standing right here in front of you. Water, a sack of water. Some people have called me something else. I prefer the sack of water. We began our lives in the womb in a sack of water, and we know our lives are over when the water is gone from us and we begin to dehydrate. Water is life. Water is necessary for life. People can go plus or minus depending on their weight going in. They can go more or less 30 days without water, some longer, some less, but you can only go 3 or 4 or 5 days. We can go 30 days without food, is what I meant to say. 30 days without food, plus or minus, but only about 3 or 4 or 5 days without water before you get into serious trouble. So water is necessary for life. It's a image that's used in the Scripture in multiple ways, just like the word for wind is. We've talked about wind and spirit and breath are all the same word. Water is used for multiple layers of meanings in Scripture as well. And in this text that Ben so longingly read, Jesus offers the Samaritan woman living water. And we're going to see in just a second that living water was one of the layers of which they used to talk about water. So let's look at this text for just a bit. A little bit of a background. I found some interesting things this week when I was reading, doing my reading for this. In the first place, I think most of you are familiar with the fact that the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. The Samaritans were the former northern part of the kingdom of Israel that broke away when King Solomon was king. After he was king, his son and the northern kingdom didn't get along, so they split. And in 722, after a long and sordid history, which you can read about in 2 Kings 17, because Pete Johnston made me lead a Bible study about it this past Friday, and tried to lead a Bible study at Pleasant Valley when it talks about nothing but the sin of Israel and them going into exile with all of these lists of names of countries that come in. Anyway, 722, the Assyrians come in and they conquer the Samaritans and they take most of the population away. That's what they did in those days. They take most of the people that lived in Samaria and exported them to 5 or 6 or 7 different cities. And they imported people from 5 nations. It's going to be important in a minute. They imported people from 5 nations into Samaria. So the Jews viewed in Jesus' day, and ever since then, ever since they were deported in 722 BC, the Jews viewed the Samaritans with contempt as half-breeds because they intermarried with the people that were imported by the Assyrians. They lost their religion. Unlike the Judeans in the south, in the kingdom of Judah, they didn't hold on to their strict Judaism. And so they were viewed as half-breeds, half-racial people. They were half-religious people. They were viewed as traitors. They were viewed as idolaters. They did not like each other. And the Samaritans had the same feeling towards the Judeans. So there was enmity between them. You'll notice that Jesus was going through Samaria and stops at a well in Samaria. That was Jacob's well. This is part of what made their relationship so difficult, was because so much biblical history had taken place in Samaria. So they were always at odds about that. Plus, another little piece of background, men and women, as you know, had, not like today, men and women had a problematic relationship in those days. Nowadays, we're modern, we've gotten over all that. Men and women no longer have problems together. But in those days, they didn't relate much in public at all. In fact, Jewish law forbade a rabbi to talk to a woman in public, even his own wife or daughter. You didn't talk to them in public. If you were walking down the street, you didn't walk next to your wife or hold her hand like we all do today. Then you had to stay separate. You had to be apart from each other. It was a Jewish law. That was the way it went. Because, you know, women were seen as the originators of the sit in the garden, they'd eaten the apple first and all that. And there was just all kinds of bad things about women and men. They didn't get along all that well in public. And then you've got Jesus coming into Samaria, going to Jacob's well at noon, sitting down, and he's thirsty and he's tired. And this woman comes from Samaria, and she is getting a drink, and Jesus asks her for a drink. Now think about that for a second. This woman comes at noon, and Jesus asks her for a drink. Think about the sort of the power relationships going on there. Jesus isn't telling her, he's not issuing a command, give me a drink, woman. He's not doing that. He's saying, please give me a drink. It's a request. So Jesus is putting himself in the position of someone who has needs, and he's allowing this woman from Samaria to be in a position of the one who supplies her needs, his needs. So there's some serious boundary breaking going on here. Jesus is crossing cultural boundaries. He's crossing gender boundaries. He's doing and saying things that no rabbi would do in those days. He's crossing social boundaries. And this woman, I'm trying to set the stage here for what happens, because it's interesting what happens. The woman, contrary to what most of us think, there's a very good possibility that she was not what we normally think. What do you think about this woman? What do you think she normally is? What's her reputation?
Not good.
Not good. Yes. We usually look at her like she is a harlot. In fact, I listened to several sermons where people said, this woman is a harlot. Well, it's interesting. It nowhere in the text says that she's a harlot. In fact, there's a possibility that she wasn't necessarily a sinner as much. I mean, obviously she was a sinner because we're all sinners. But she wasn't necessarily as much of a sinner as she was sinned against, because of the Old Testament lesson that I had read. And the Samaritans were particularly susceptible to this. In those days, in warfare, you could, after you conquered a people, you could get the plunder and the spoils. And part of the plunder and the spoils that you could get were the women. And if you happened to see a woman that struck your fancy, you could take her for yourself. And after you went through a period of time where she was given a month to mourn for her family. And then you could take her for your wife. And you could go into her, and she was yours. And then, if you found anything that displeased you about her, if she didn't delight you, you could send her away. That happened a lot. And there's every possibility that this woman of Samaria was not a harlot, but was somebody who had been used and used and used by men again and again in that kind of way. Just something to think about. It adds an interesting little twist to the text. Because notice, Jesus doesn't tell her like he does in other places where other men and women are caught in sin. He doesn't say to her, go and sin no more. That never happens. In fact, after that thing where Jesus says to her, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now is not your husband, Jesus doesn't come back around to that. So it's interesting to think that this woman maybe isn't the kind of low reputation woman that we think of and let the men off the hook. Like, where were the 5 husbands that she supposedly had? And by the way, when Samaria was conquered, there were 5 kingdoms that came in and conquered it. And sometimes people would talk about that metaphorically, like being married to someone. So it could be that they're having this metaphorical conversation. Anyway, that's not important. The important thing is this. She comes to the point where she sees Jesus is the Messiah. That's the whole point of this conversation about living water and wanting water and so on. She comes to the point in verse 19 where she says, I see that you're a prophet. In the Gospel of John, when somebody sees something, they perceive something, it means that they're coming to faith. In every instance in the Gospel of John where there's somebody talking to Jesus like this, they see something, and it means they're coming to faith. So this woman is coming to faith. She makes a confession of faith. She sees that he's a prophet. And she notices that he hasn't rejected her or condemned her. Just like the woman in John 8, who was caught in adultery, who probably did have a bad reputation, and Jesus says, does anybody condemn you? And she says, no. He says, I don't either. Go your way. Sin no more. Don't do it again. So she sees that despite this past that she has that involves an abuse, perhaps, at the hands of the men in her life, that nevertheless, Jesus doesn't treat her like that. He hasn't rejected her. He hasn't condemned her. He hasn't made fun of her. He hasn't gossiped about her. That's probably why she came to the well in the first place at noon, because nobody goes to a well at noon. And you know, if you're hurting sometimes, you don't want other people around. You want to be alone. So here's a woman, she's got this reputation, she's had this bad past. She goes to the well to avoid people and runs into Jesus. She has a conversation with him. The other thing is that it's interesting, at the turning point of the conversation, after Jesus says, you've had 5 husbands, the man you're living with now is not your husband. She says, I see you're a prophet. And she asks him a religious question. Now, so many people say this is a dodge. She's obviously trying to turn the conversation away from her past so that she can get... I don't think that's true at all. Jesus doesn't go, now wait a minute, before you rush on to religion, let's talk about this moral problem that you have. He doesn't do that. She goes right to the heart of the differences between Jews and Samaritans. She goes right to the most important topic that they've been talking about all the way through this conversation, living water. And the question is, where is the right place to worship? Where are we to find this living water? So she's not trying to dodge out of anything. She's going to the heart of the issue. And Jesus goes with her, because I think that's exactly what was going on. She wants to know, where do I get this living water? Where's the right place to worship? Who's right in this whole thing? And Jesus says, look, it doesn't matter. A time is coming, and now is when it doesn't matter if you worship in Jerusalem or on the hill of Samaria. Nothing. The Father's looking for people who worship in spirit and in truth. And that's where he wants to take her. And that's where they end up. And notice that, I think this is so true to life. It's amazing to me that they come in this long conversation. The time, Jesus says, this is in verse 23, a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, because those are the kinds of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and truth. The woman says, I know that the Messiah who is called Christ is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus says, I who speak to you am he. They've gotten right to the nub of the conversation, and what happens? The disciples come blundering back in. Haven't you ever had that happen? I mean, It happens all the time. It's almost like sometimes you think, is the devil trying to stop this conversation from happening? Or what? Because you'll be talking to somebody, and you'll get right to the heart of what you want to say, and then the dog runs into the room. Or somebody calls on the phone. Same thing happens here. But the point is that she gets where he wants her to be. She recognizes that he's the Messiah. That's the important thing. That's where he's been leading her in this conversation. I who speak to you am he. I'm the Christ. She knows where to find the living water. Jesus breaks down social barriers. He breaks down cultural barriers. He breaks down religious barriers. He breaks down gender barriers, all to bring this woman to see where she can find what true living water is all about. Her soul is thirsty for living water. She wants this living water. Psalm 63:1. Thirsting for living water is a metaphor for the soul's thirst for God. We'll read it when we get to the psalm prayer, because that's the psalm prayer for the day. The soul's thirst for God longs for God like a weary soul in a weary land. The soul's thirst for God, the living God, is quenched by believing exactly what this woman came to believe. Let me read it to you again. The woman said, I know that the Messiah, called the Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Jesus declares, I who speak to you am he. Jesus is the one who teaches and gives and lives the living water, which is access to God by worship in spirit and in truth. And notice what happens to her. She becomes a missionary. She becomes a disciple. She runs into town. She leaves her water pot there. I think it means she intends to come back and get it because she wants more of this water. But however you look at that, some people say you drop the most important thing in your life, whatever it is, and you run to tell other people. You're so excited. However you want to look at that, like Calvin would say, I'm not going to fight about it. She goes and tells all the people in town. She goes to the town square where the men are, and she says, look, come and see this guy who told me everything I've ever done. Is this the Messiah? She becomes a disciple, a missionary. And people from the town go out with her back to Jesus, and they prevail upon him to stay there for a couple of days. He stays there a couple of days, and they say, while he's getting ready to leave, they say to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said, important as that was. But we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. When you come to the Lord's Supper today, come in faith that your thirsty soul will be quenched with the water of the gospel. Know that your thirsty soul, which longs for forgiveness and reconciliation with God, will be quenched as we receive the body and the blood. Your hunger for God will be satisfied with the bread of heaven. Doesn't mean your life will get great. It means that your soul will be satisfied. It means that you will feel that inner peace that comes from knowing that God receives you and accepts you and forgives you and loves you and welcomes you. That's what this is about. That's what Jesus was about in drawing her to himself, the source of living water. Let's close it in a word of prayer.